or a phone call that would say something like, you people aren't telling the whole truth. There are other kinds of experience. I had one, and it wasn't blissful. Or very rarely, but someone would say, I died and went to hell. And I realized that I was not the only one to have had a difficult time with this kind of experience. And out of that came this determination that somebody had to find something to say to people who had the dark experiences, because otherwise it was just heavenly realms, and that wasn't the whole story. Now, obviously, that presents some very real difficulties, particularly for those of us who theologically weren't at all sure what to believe about doctrines of hell. And that's essentially why it took so long to get the book written.
Well, you jump into the deep end of the pool right off the bat. You quote Albert Einstein talking about his famous remark that the most important question facing humankind is the universe a friendly place or not? And you note science really can't provide a friendly universe, but it can provide a description of what is observed. Now, looking back on all of the research, let's say in a general sense, is the universe a friendly place or not?
I think the universe is both a friendly and a potentially unfriendly place. Essentially, I think friendly is a very human way of wanting to define it. But what has really undergirded my work for these past 30 years is the recognition that any of us, no matter who we are, the scientists, the theologians, the plumbers, the school teachers, the talk show radio hosts, the people at the other end of their phone, we are all sharing the same universe, and we're all looking out at it and saying, where are we? How does this place work? Which is, of course, what people have said since they first climbed down out of the trees and began roaming the savannas of the ancient world. Where are we? Are we safe here? And the answer is both yes and no. If we look from our vantage point today as a Hubble people, we have seen those pictures of the most distant space science can show us. And it's both glorious and terrifying. It isn't either or, it's both and. Some parts of it are peaceful and serene. Other parts are explosive and generative. Other parts of it, as in dark holes, are terrifyingly, apparently annihilating everything that comes into their field.
Nancy Evans Bush, author of Dancing Past the Dark. The music tells us we're taking a break. When we come back, we'll get into some specifics about stories you've heard of other distressing near-death experiences. Stay with us, everyone. Coast to Coast AM continues. The near-death experience, as we've heard on the program in previous interviews, goes to the heart of who we are, why we're here, what comes next, central to the human experience in this lifetime on this planet. Nancy Evans Bush is looking at it from a different perspective, distressing near-death experiences and what they might teach us about the big questions. We continue our conversation with some examples from her research right after this on Coast to Coast AM. To recap so far, Nancy Evans Bush had her own near-death experience, not all that pleasant. It's what she calls a distressing NDE of her own in the early 60s, and years later, coincidentally or not, finds herself working for a program, a research program, looking at near-death experiences. And as she examines the letters that come in and the reports and phone calls, she finds out that she's not the only one who had a distressing near-death experience. Nancy, can you describe for me, if there were 10, in a sample of 10 NDEs, how many might be negative as yours was? Not necessarily negative, but distressing.
The best information we've got is that perhaps as many as 1 in 5. So out of 10 near-death experiences, possibly 2 would be either entirely distressing or at least in part frightening. Now, to say that they're frightening does not mean that they all involve actual perceptions of hell, because essentially they fall into 3 categories. Some experiences that terrify people really, if you just look at their elements, sound exactly like the same things people describe of the most pleasant experiences. Again, out-of-body experience, the floating through space or shooting through space, encounters with the landscape, with entities, but in their case, even though the landscape may be beautiful, the out-of-body experience may be pleasant, the entities may be family members and friends who have died previously, the experiencers are terrified because the whole thing seems so out of control. The kind of thing about which people say, I was shooting out of my body, and I thought, I'm not supposed to be out here. I'm supposed to be back in my body. What am I doing here? This isn't right. And things move too fast. They're too unexpected. It's as if, put yourself in the position of a person who has such an experience. And all of a sudden, instead of sitting wherever you're sitting right this minute, you're 20 feet above yourself looking down and you see yourself. But nobody can hear you. Nobody pays any attention to you. There's just your body is doing whatever it's doing, completely independently of your observation. And this sense of being so out of control and powerless is a very, very frightening experience for many people. Now, other people may have a very similar out-of-body experience and think, as one young woman said, she was just ecstatic. Isn't this fun? Look, I'm flying. It's like Peter Pan. I'm flying.
I would think so. Yeah, I would think so.
A lot of the emotional response depends on the person who's having the experience. and how they interpret it. So there's that type which has all the descriptive elements of a positive, really great experience, except that the person experiences it as disorienting and just not the way things are supposed to be done. So there's that type. Then there is the experience like mine, which in which really the bulk of the experience involves being in a featureless void. Now, for someone who is, say, a Buddhist, who is accustomed to the concept of, say, nirvana, of an emptiness that is not really empty, but that's featureless. This is an understandable, or at least an acceptable idea. For those of us in the West, from a Judeo-Christian historical tradition, everything we know from the time we are tiny involves objects and relationships. So to find ourselves in a what appears to be totally empty space, even if it contains all potentialities, the difficulty here, you see, is that potentialities aren't necessarily visible yet. They're still only potential. So there seems to be nothing there. And those of us who are Westerners typically see this as being either obliterated ourselves or we are simply lost. If you think of the song Lost in the Stars, except that even the stars aren't there. So that's a second kind of terrifying experience. And the third type of distressing NDE is the least common, and that's the one that has, in which people define it as being hell-like. And that can be hot, it can be cold, it can have a bleak landscape, typically bleak landscape. It can involve entities, but the ones I have heard described most frequently are not what we see in pictures from Dante's Inferno. It's not little demons with arrow-barbed tails and pitchforks. What the experiences I have heard have involved mostly seeing kind of shadowy, somber-looking people at a distance. If there are people close by, they very frequently, their faces are either obscured or they are faceless.